Daniel Lucier. I'm the CEO of the Reseau Compassion Network. And on behalf of all the partners, Reseau de Montreal, the Grey Nuns, the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions, and the Catholic Network for Women's Equality, we're just really delighted that you said yes to join the conversation today. On est vraiment épaté de la réponse. On est au-dessus de 300 personnes qui se sont enregistrées. We had over 300 people register for today. So again, it's quite remarkable. Really an opportunity for us to come together, to gather, to listen, to discern, and an opportunity to hear and be in dialogue with Sister of Mercy, Elizabeth Davis. So we welcome you all, and we'll shortly hear from her and hear about her experience in attending the Synod on Synodality, the Vatican, earlier this fall. But before we move along, I want to acknowledge that the Reseau Compassion Network, its organizations, we work and we play and we live on the territories covered by Treaty 1 and 2. We're hosting you from those territories today. These are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Innuit and Saulteaux people, ainsi que la patrie de la patrie nationale des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge. Nous respectons les traités qui ont été conclus sur ces territoires et nous tenons également à reconnaître les erreurs, les actions, les inactions du passé qui ont causé beaucoup de tort au peuple autochtone du Canada. On ne connaîtra jamais avec exactitude l'ampleur de ces torts qui ne pourront jamais être effacés. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. I would like to acknowledge the mistakes, the actions, the lack of actions in the past that have caused so many harms to our Indigenous people here in Canada. Those harms can never be fully counted. Those harms can never be undone. As much as we'd like to, we can't change that past, but we are, however, responsible for our actions here and now, and especially on this sacred land. Let our actions contribute to a more loving, just, compassionate world where we move forward in the spirit of reconciliation. Again, welcome. We know we have so many people that have said yes. On aimerait vous inviter dans la fonction chat de nous écrire un peu d'où vous êtes là aujourd'hui. We have so many people. We'd love you to just take a moment using your chat function, maybe to let us know where you're participating from, the city you're in, or even the traditional territories you might be on. And just let us know where you're joining us for today. So if you have 2 minutes to do that and are comfortable with the chat function, just populate that. And as that gets populated, I'm just going to handle just a few housekeeping details for our gathering today. And that'll be before I introduce you to Sister Veronica Dunn, who will be our moderator for today, who will then, of course, introduce Sister Elizabeth Davis. The first thing is I would like to invite you all to put yourselves on mute. So if you can use the mute function, si vous pouvez vous mettre en sourdine, that'll just assure a good quality experience for everyone. This way we're not picking up a lot of the background noise from wherever you may be today. So please, if you could put yourself on mute, that'd be great. If not, we do have the capacity to do that. And we will, but we would appreciate and invite you to do that for us. La deuxième chose, c'est que la session va être enregistrée. We just wanted to share with you that we are recording this session today, so we can share it with others who were not able to join us. If for whatever reason that might be uncomfortable for you, perhaps we would invite you to consider simply turning off your camera. That might be a suggestion that may allow you to feel comfortable and continue to be with us in this conversation. The format for today, just very quickly, we're going to open up with an opening prayer. We will then introduce Sister Veronica Dunn, our moderator, who will then introduce Sister Davis. She'll share her thoughts, experience for about 40 minutes. And then we're going to invite everyone in to participate into a chat room. and it's an opportunity for you to have a conversation in a smaller group and share what might be emerging for you in this conversation and in this time together. And don't worry, we'll provide you, Sister Veronica will provide you a little bit more information on an invitation on how we might be together in those chat rooms very shortly. And then we'll come back together. On va revenir après les sessions de breakout ensemble. And we'll continue our conversation with Sister Elizabeth and look to conclude around 1:30 Central Time. And that'll be done with a thank you, which will be provided by Louise Dolan. So that's the format for today. That's le format pour aujourd'hui, puis ce que nous vous proposons comme un voyage ensemble. And so to begin our time, we'd like to open up with a short synod prayer. And the prayer will be offered to us by 4 readers, Sister Sandy Stewart, Sister Joanne Duggan, Sister Noini Du, and Michelle Larose. And with that, I'd like to invite Sister Sandy to start us off.
Thank you, Dan. A prayer for our synodal path. Source.
Sorry, Sister Sandy, you're on mute again. I apologize for that.
Source, sojourner and spirit.
Oh, no.
To journey with you is to walk with our gazes fixed upon a horizon of hope. To journey with one another is our challenge and our calling. You call us to move with missionary urgency, to become a more vibrantly living sign of your love in the world.
Break us out of worn paths. Free us from the thickets of we've always done this before. And for those who may be frightened by the new vista revealed, grant boldness of heart.
May we become a church where its vocation are welcomed, celebrated, and nurtured, where your priests reflect the diversity of your people, and where our structures are at the service of your kingdom of radically lovely inclusion.
Cultivate in us a holy, healthy restlessness on this synodal path. Make us unafraid of prophetic decisions that take us along uncharted territory. Give us the radical unity that is your gift and promise. Grant us generosity of trust and expansiveness of hope as we say, Amen, may it be so.
Thank you all for opening us up in such a way. And now my job for today is complete, and I had the privilege to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's experience and journey. It's my pleasure to introduce Sister Veronica Dunn. She's a sister of Our Lady of the Missions, and she's also a member of the Catholic Network for Women's Equality, and she'll be guiding our time today. Sister Veronica, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dan. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to see all of you here. As part of introducing Elizabeth Davis, I want to acknowledge the presence at this Zoom of 9 members of the Catholic Network for Women's Equality 8 intrepid women, and 1 intrepid man, who in October 2023 were part of a synod outside the walls in Rome, while Elizabeth was part of the synod inside the walls in Rome. Elizabeth generously met with the CNWE members in Rome and indicated at that time that she was willing to meet again back in Canada. So through a wonderful collaboration with Reseau Compassion Network, the CNWE, the Grey Nuns of Montreal, and the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions, and the Sisters of Mercy, here we are. To know more about Elizabeth, I suggest that you Google her name. There you will find multiple entries indicating her commitments, her advocacy, her achievements, her opinions, and her awards. I also want to note that today, January 17th, is the 4th anniversary of the death of the poet Mary Oliver. And I invoke Mary Oliver's memory and presence and her work of paying attention today, because among her other gifts, Elizabeth also has a poetic soul. Continuing, Elizabeth Davis is a Sister of Mercy, of Newfoundland and Labrador, of Earth. She is a scripture scholar, a teacher, a healthcare administrator, a religious leader. She was one of 54 women voting delegates to the Vatican Synod on Synodality in October 2023. And today, she is here with us. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Just begin my slides and make sure they're working. Paul, is everything in order?
Yes, looks great.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very, very much for facilitating this meeting, putting it together, bringing together such a diverse group of people. And I noticed not just from Canada, but some from other places as well. I'm very pleased to be here to present my reflections from the synod that I attended, and one that I'm invited to attend again this coming October. When we left the Synod Hall at the end of October 23, we were encouraged when we spoke to groups to speak from our own lived experience of the Synod. And that's what I will do today. So my reflection will be in 2 parts. I will give you some feeling for my presence there to get a sense of the relational sense, I suppose, of how I participated. Then I'll talk a bit about the fruits of that synod, the documentation that we have received. The more important part of this conversation, though, for me, is the questions and comments that will come from you. If I go back in October to the synod, knowing exactly what I know when I left this past October, I will be useless. So I need to go back with new wisdom, new insights, new energy, new fervor, new hopes, new dreams. And each conversation I have, I'm starting to build that new treasure that I carry with me. Today will be especially so, I believe. This will be the largest group I will have spoken to thus far. And it will also be perhaps the most diverse group that I'm speaking to. I also need to tell you, as I saw your names appear, there are many of my friends among the group from my past. My past with the Western part of Canada is primarily a healthcare directed past. So it was so good to see your names appear and bring back so many good memories to me. So my journey in this synodal path. I begin with the image of the synod because that has been for me a very significant icon that I have used consistently. And I show the artist who drew that image. She's a graphic artist from France, a laywoman, Isabelle de Saint-Ile. The synodal image is important to me in its hopes, its dreams that are embedded in it. We have the image of the people walking together, all different colors, different shapes. The Pope, the sister are walking in the middle, not at the beginning, not at the end. There are people with wheelchairs and canes, and we are all being led by a little child and a teenager. And that is a synodal community. We see what looks like a tree, and it does stand for the trees that are so rich in Canada, but it also stands for the cross that is fundamental to our own Paschal mystery as for those of us who are Christian. The yellow and the branches of the tree also echo the wings of the dove, which is a representation for the Holy Spirit present among us, always with wings outstretched. The golden ball, of course, is our sun, that which holds us steady in this universe that we're part of. It is also representative of the Eucharist within the Christian and particularly the Roman Catholic tradition. The multiple colors get replicated in the words on the image, and the three themes of the church: communion, mission, and participation are embedded in the image, as is the plea for a synodal church, not the church of today, a church that we have yet to create together, a goal for which, a vision for which we are very much plaintively pleading, I would say. This is my first meeting ever with Pope Francis. I've been in his presence before, but never met him personally. I'm wearing my red jacket. One of the group who knows me well, when I made a presentation last week in one of the parishes, said, "Elizabeth, have you got anything else to wear except that red jacket?" And I do have other things, but here I happen to be wearing that, fortunately, because it made me stand out in the group. Because I also use a walker. I couldn't stand when the Pope was coming. That's the first night when we had our ecumenical vigil led by Taizé. And Pope Francis reached out to me as he came down in his chair. And as you can see, he's looking right at me. It's a very precious image to me from that moment. The first 3 days we gathered there were 363 delegates, voting delegates. The first 3 days when we gathered, we went outside to the north of Rome to a retreat center run by a lay group. We spent 3 days together getting to know each other a little better. But we also there were led in our reflections by Father Timothy Radcliffe, a Dominican from the United Kingdom, who for many years was the master of the Dominicans around the world, and Sister Maria Ignazia Angelini, who is a cloistered sister from the north of Italy, from Milan. Both of them led us in prayer reflections on this retreat, but they also led us in reflections throughout our time together. The third purpose of our gathering together was to learn better conversations in the Spirit. The way we worked together for the whole of October was in small groups, following this conversation in the Spirit. We met in groups of between 10 and 12 people. In those conversations, we would each speak for 4 minutes uninterrupted on a theme that would be followed by quiet and prayer. Then we would speak a second time, interrupted, but in the second round, we would reflect back what we had learned from the others in the first round, and then prayer again. And then in the third round, we shared ideas, what we saw as convergences, what we saw as divergences. Many of the religious on this call will know we use processes like that in our chapters and assemblies. But for most of the participants in the synod, this was new. And remember, the majority of the participants in the synod were bishops and cardinals, and this was a process that was new to them. And we practice this in our 3 days retreat. So then, when we came together for our first Mass, we held that first Mass in the square itself, in St. Peter's Square. We were the group who were gathered on the left-hand side where all the white is. The cardinals and bishops were in their white robes and mitres. So that's our group gathered there. I'll come back to that image because it's not the image of the church we would want to hold moving forward. But that first Mass was held in the open in the Synod, in the square in St. Peter's Square. You're familiar, I think, with the Synodal process initially, and many of the older icons show 2021 to 2023. Pope Francis called the Synod up to 2023, then realized very quickly that he needed to bring it to 2024 in order to have a more fulsome and rich conversation globally. This synodal conversation is the largest conversation that's ever been held globally. We need to remember that by anybody. So it's quite significant, quite historic. So the early stages were involving parishes, community groups. Then we moved into diocesan conversations. Then we had the diocese for the first time. No, then there were national conversations. Then for the first time, the national conversations were brought into continental assemblies, new in our church. For North America, the two countries were Canada and the United States. Mexico chose to go with the South American continental group. Pope Francis added another continent to that grouping, the digital continent, the one that has not got a geographical grounding. These assemblies then presented the fruits of their conversations to the writing group in Rome who developed the Instrumentum Laboris, the working paper, and that working paper was the paper we worked with when we gathered at the Synod. The three themes for the Synod itself, the three themes around which the working paper was developed, were communion, mission, and participation. And the language of a communion that radiates right away spoke to us about more than just a communion. It reminded us that we are a global church. There are 1.4 billion of us. We're certainly not a united church. We're a fractured, broken church. But we are called to become that sign of communion that radiates, that by its very presence changes the world around it in ways of peace and justice. In terms of mission, the full Synod focused on co-responsibility in mission. How do we each carry our share, each of us who's baptized and share the gifts of baptism, how do we share in the tasks that are in the service of the gospel? And finally, the third is the pragmatic one, the participation, knowing that we are in a communion that radiates, that we're co-responsible in mission. How in this moment in time do we make that real? What are the processes and structures and instruments that will make that real? When I'm asked what does the Synod mean, for me it means simply two things. The Greek word, as you know, means walking with. I add, though, listening to, because I believe walking with by itself doesn't completely describe that synodal process. Walking with, listening to, and as I talk on, you're going to get a sense from me that works right through the themes that work right through everything I will be saying. Here we are gathered as our full group. This is the group of the voting delegates, the facilitators, the theologians, and the communicators. So there are more than just the voting delegates here, roughly another 90 to 100 people who make up the theologians, the communicators, and the facilitators. Again, I'm on the left-hand side with my red jacket on, which is why I have that reputation. There were 3 of us of that group who had disabilities. I use a walker. The Pope Francis always came in a wheelchair. And in this image next to Pope Francis, you see a man in a blue suit, a layman from Spain who came in an electric wheelchair. And he, from time to time, offered myself and Pope Francis that we could use his electric wheelchair. The picture, as you know, is taken in the Pope Paul VI Hall, and you'll recognize that's a modern building, relatively in the 1970s, in front of that famous sculpture of the risen Christ rising from a nuclear blast. This was the scene of every single day in that hall in the Synod. We were divided into 32 tables by language. There were 5 languages. The main language was Italian, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. These are all European languages, as you will recognize. Most people not from Europe, and even some from Europe, not of those 5 languages, chose English as their main language, second language. So many of the English-speaking tables had people for whom English was not their first language. We came every day into the hall, went to our tables, worked in small groups, and from time to time engaged in plenary conversations. I'm just going to give you 2 of the tables at which I sat to give you a flavor for the diversity in the room. So looking first at the bishop with the gray shirt on, this man is a bishop from East Timor. East Timor is the 2nd youngest country on earth, gained its independence from Indonesia in the 1990s. And his main concern for his people is how do we reconcile the people of East Timor with the people of Indonesia, given that we still feel the pain of their oppression. Next to him is the bishop from South Sudan. He right now says his country is at some peace because the fighting is in Sudan itself. So he knows it's only a matter of time for his place to become more troubled again. Next to him is a bishop from Poland, and just days before he had come to our meeting, his people had voted out their right-wing government, and the coalition was trying to find a way to come together to become the ruling government in Poland. Next, that's me, not with my red jacket on. Next to me is a lay woman from Fiji. Next to her is a sister from India wearing a beautiful sari. Next to her is our facilitator at that table, who was a young woman from Lebanon who did not know if she was going to get back home because the war had broken out between Hamas and Israel. Next to her was a deacon from Syria, permanent deacon. He did not know if he would get home, and we later learned that his sister was actually killed in the fighting. Next to him is somebody many of you may know, Bishop Robert Barron from the United States, who would be philosophically somewhat further from me on the right. Next to him is the bishop from Liberia. Next to him is the newly minted cardinal, who had been married cardinal the week before, from Hong Kong. And when we came back, the week we came back from the Synod, he was in the news because the bishops of China for the first time were coming over to meet with him in Hong Kong. Next to him is somebody you may also recognize, Cardinal Supage, who's a cardinal from Chicago. If Bishop Barron would be right of me theologically and philosophically, Cardinal Supage will be left philosophically and theologically, I would say. A second table that I was on, the young woman with the green blouse was from Myanmar. 3 people from Myanmar, Cardinal Bo, whom you may recognize his name, and another bishop and sister, and the young woman, a lay woman. Next to her is the bishop from Germany. You may recognize him as well, Bishop Batzing. He's the leader of the Bishops' Conference in Germany. And you know, right now, Germany is in hot water with Rome because they're moving too quickly on the Synod ideas. Next to him again is the permanent deacon from Syria. Next to him is a woman, the facilitator for our group, who is from Australia. Next to her is a man from India, but whose ministry is as a lay missionary in Saudi Arabia. I had never even thought about Roman Catholics in Saudi Arabia before. Next to him is a bishop from Uganda. Next to him, the bishop from Zimbabwe. Next to him is a sister, Mary Barron, from Ireland. Her congregation, she's the leader of her congregation in Rome. She's now the leader of the group of the sisters who are congregations around the world. She spent most of her adult life in missionary work in Africa. Next to her is Bishop Poisson, some of you may know, from Quebec. Next to me in the front is Cardinal Cherney, Canadian Jesuit, who's the head of the Dicastery for Human Development. As he said, Elizabeth and I don't always agree, but we always agree to have conversation. And next to him is Hans Lessing, who is the executive secretary of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. There were representatives from all the major Christian churches present. They, other than the Roman Catholic Church, of course, the Eastern churches that were in communion with Rome were present, full voting participants. But then the Christian churches who are not in communion with Rome were present, fully participated in the conversations at the table, but would not have the right to vote. So you can see from this table that we had 4 screens that we sometimes were given information on, but each one of us has in front of us our own laptop for our own use for various purposes. And in the middle, the white space-like thing is a camera, so that when we were in plenary session, when we were given the go-ahead to speak, the camera would turn to us so the whole group could see who the speaker was. The head table wasn't too noticeably different from the rest of our tables. That was where the Synod team sat. Pope Francis joined us whenever there was a plenary session. He wasn't there for all the sessions because many times it was just small group work. Next to him is Cardinal Grech, who was really the leader of the team. Next to him, Cardinal Hollerich, and the 2 of them with Sister Natalie were kind of the core of the team that led the process. Now, you saw that picture of us coming together in the Synod room in our round tables, where I spoke for 4 minutes, the Cardinal next to me spoke for 4 minutes, and if either one of us went over, we were both asked to end our comments. In other words, I was at that table treated equally with all the other members who are present there. However, when we went to the square, when we went to the Basilica for Mass, we lined up according to rank. So you can see this was the last Mass for the Synod. I would have hoped by then we would maybe have not done this, but because of the good experience we had had. But here you have the cardinals in front, followed by the archbishops, followed by the bishops and priests, and then the rest of us. So we reverted back immediately to our hierarchical way of being church. This is a gathering of the women. We met at the UISG headquarters one afternoon. This would be a mix then of voting delegates, theologians, facilitators, and communicators. You can see different ages, different colors, different sizes. So and I will assure you, different philosophies, different theologies, different ecclesiologies. But we were a small group, as you can see from that very large group you saw in the earlier image. This is the group who were delegates because we were members of religious communities, 5 women and 5 men. The 5 men had 3 priests and 2 brothers. The 5 women, of the 5 women, 2 leaders of congregations and 2 of us were not. One of the highlights of our time there was a prayer gathering in the evening after our day's work in St. Peter's Square for migrants and refugees. And we had that gathering because all through our time in October, we were more than conscious of the plight of migrants and refugees around the world. We had a young woman from Moscow and 2 bishops from the Ukraine who sometimes sat at the same table. We had, as you saw, people from Lebanon, from Syria, from Israel, from Palestine. We had people from African countries in deep turmoil. So we were very conscious of refugees in oppressed countries. We were also very conscious of refugees from countries for whom the climate emergency is putting at risk. So one of the bishops I sat with at the table on 2 occasions was from the central part of the Pacific. He has a very small group of people in his diocese, 14,000, but they're spread across 20 islands. And most of their islands will be gone in 5 years' time, and they have nowhere yet to go to live. So they're refugees from oppression and refugees from climate change. The statue or the sculpture you see here was done by a Canadian artist, sculptor Timothy Schmaltz. Some of you will know his sculpture perhaps of the homeless Christ, for which he's more known. Cardinal Czerny had commissioned this for St. Peter's Square. The evening we went for this, because I use a walker, I was somewhat hampered in my ability to get around. Never stopped me from going where I needed or wanted to go. But anyway, the evening we came out for this, came out of our meeting to go to the square, the doors were staffed by Swiss guards and police. And because I was using a walker, I used the lower door, which very few people used. So the Swiss guards and police there saw me 4 times a day coming and going, and were very, very supportive of me, actually treated me lovingly like their grandmother, not even their mother, but their grandmother. The evening here, the Swiss guards said to me, and they always helped me get in the car, helped me took the walker, helped me sit in the car. So the Swiss guard said to me, "Are you going to the square?" And I said, "No, in the dark, I can't go on the cobblestones. It's too risky for me." So he said, "Well, can I get you a wheelchair and take you?" And I said, "No, that's too much bother for you, and I wouldn't want that." So he left me before my car came, which surprised me. Then the other Swiss guard, who was wearing the Swiss guard dress, came and helped me in the car and said to the sister driving me, "Wait." He went, and then the policeman came. And when the policeman came, he said to sister, "I think we can get you in the square." So you see the picture on the left-hand side of our little group in front of the sculpture in the huge St. Peter's Square, and notice the very little car in the middle of at the right-hand side of the picture. That car is sister's car. She was allowed to drive in the square so that I could go to that gathering. It was a very touching moment of synodality, actually, that I experienced. We were allowed to leave the car there through the whole ceremony. The Swiss guard met me, brought me to my chair, brought me back to the car, and then the Pope came in a wheelchair, but I came in the car. So the process, that's my lived experience. So what about the process? Well, the thing that impresses you first when you walk into that hall is the diversity. And the fact that whether we come from Asia or Africa or India or North America or South America or Asia or Europe or the Middle East, we're coming with a vision for a better church. But there is also in that moment a sense of how incomplete, how vulnerable, how flawed, how broken we are as a church. The good news about that is our openness to change, that there was among us, despite all the diversity of our ways of thinking and believing, there was an openness to try to be better. And that's what gave me the courage to go on. Our process very much was multifaceted. Very much at the center were the conversations in the Spirit, which became very much making sure all our voices were heard. Now, as I remind you, 15% of us there in that room were women. Even if all of us thought the same and voted the same, which we didn't, but even if we did, we wouldn't have made any difference to the outcome by our vote because we were such a small presence there. If that group had been truly representative of our church, 80% of the people there would have been women and 20% would have been men. So we're conscious of that. But with that aside, the conversation of the Spirit allowed those of us who were present to have a voice, and our voice was heard. There was a very nice movement of silence and prayer. There was also a sense of encounter. Meeting is I meet you and two of us exchange commentary and go away. Encounter means you and I meet, we exchange commentary, and we both go away changed. When Timothy Radcliffe gave us a beautiful presentation on the Samaritan woman, after he and I lived in the same residence. So I said to him, I thanked him at lunch for his powerful reflection for us. And I said, and Timothy, was only one part not finished. Now, I don't think Father Radcliffe is used to being challenged. And he said, oh, what was that, Elizabeth? And I said, you didn't remind us that Jesus also changed in that encounter. It wasn't just the Samaritan woman and the people from her village who changed, but Jesus himself also changed. And there's wonderful evidence in the scripture passage that shows that. So encounter is more than just meeting. And then action, we have to do something. It's all very well to reflect on this and talk about this and be changed by it, but we also have to act. I spoke earlier to you about conversation in the Spirit. This is a kind of a formal presentation of that. So what were the fruits of the Synod of the session? From the beginning, Pope Francis had been very clear that there would not be decisions coming out of the Synod. The purpose of this Synod was to explore, reflect more deeply with each other, to learn together more, to be more conscious and aware of our convergences and divergences, and that's the language they used. The next session is the one when decisions will be recommended to His Holiness. The fruits of the Synod were two. One was a 2-page letter to the people of God, and the second is a 41-page, at least in English, a 41-page synthesis of what we discussed together, entitled A Synodal Church in Mission. So these are the documents we have been asked to work with. The contents of that Synodal Church in Mission really follow those 3 themes. Part 1, the face of the Synodal Church is around communion. Part 2, all disciples, all missionaries, is around mission. And part 3, weaving bonds, building communities, is around participation. So the document is the working paper had used explicitly the terms communion, mission, and participation, with questions related to each. This synthesis uses the same themes without explicitly naming those 3 words. And you can see there are 20 chapters, if you will, 20 sections in the report, and with a beginning, an introduction, and then an exhortation at the end. So these are the documents that we will be encouraged to work with over the time between the 2 sessions. What I'm going to do is give you a flavor for what's contained in those documents with some references of where they come from. Again, only a flavor. There's no way we would have the time or energy to go through the whole thing. The documents recognize that we have many voices, many positions, across our church. Within any single country, we have many voices and many positions, and that some of these have led to polarization and distrust, whether it's around liturgical life or morals or social or theological reflection. There is polarization and there is distrust among us, and we are being called through dialogue to really move to places of revitalization and reconciliation. Not to make all our voices the same. That's never been asked, even though that we held that so often as a theme function. That requires that we truly listen. And both the letter and the synthesis reinforce that. The need to listen to all the laity, to catechists, to the first proclaimers of the gospel, to children, to young people, to elderly people, to truly listen. And the synthesis says to listen as well to those who are not always heard or who are not as easily heard. Sometimes because of who they are, sometimes because of where they come from. And they highlighted particularly listening to young people, women, and minority groups. There were many references to young people, and the Pope, in his own words, as well as the synthesis document, pointed out that this particular synod on synodality really flowed from the desires that were expressed by young people in the Synod on Youth, which was held in 2018. So that sense of a call to becoming a synodal church and mission, he told us, and the document reflects, really came from young people. The synthesis document reinforces the need, therefore, that we become more intergenerational, that we listen to young people, not just talk about young people, and that we attend to the digital world that many of them are so much part of. There was also a very stark and solid reference to family, to reminding us that parents and grandparents are usually the first missionaries in our church, that the family is a privileged place, and then a reminder that our church has not always listened to those two pieces, and therefore the church has not structured itself and organized itself around family and how the family functions, but has kind of forced family to fit into its own structures. The Synod quite explicitly names that we need to reorganize our pastoral structures and animate lay charisms ministries in a different way. Now, Vatican II called for this, as we know, but we never fully or even partially, I think, realized it. And that reminding us that structures are in the service of mission that's carried out primarily by lay people within society, in the family, and in the work life. And therefore, we need to be organized with that within that. The sections on women in the synthesis document are good and not so good. The good sections remind us that women and men together are clothed with the same baptismal dignity and receive equally the gifts of the Spirit. It is mindful of the fact that women are still in our world crying out for justice because of societies marked by sexual violence, economic inequality, and the tendency to treat us as objects. Women are scarred by human trafficking, forced migration, and war. Women and children more so than men even. It says quite pragmatically, where dignity and justice are undermined in relationships between men and women in the church, we weaken the credibility of our proclamation to the world. And that has to change. In a less favorable note, the synthesis document still speaks to complementarity and reciprocity of women and men, that a dualistic sense that all women are alike and all men are alike, which is not so from any lens you look at women and men. And that complementarity and reciprocity put in that kind of language is really not helpful to how our church needs to become a synodal church. One of the cardinals at the table, one of the days I was there, said to me, Elizabeth, I'm not quite getting what you're saying to me when you talk about this dualism. He said, I think women in your role should be fully supported, and we don't do that. We should do that. And I think men in their roles should be fully supported. I said, but Cardinal's a funny thing. My roles are always subservient to your roles. And he said, I guess that's what you're trying to say. So that sense that we don't have in our church, that we say we're fully equal in our baptism and in the gifts of the Spirit, but we don't really mean it in real life, in action. We were in the document, there is a reference to a greater openness to women's access to the diaconate. However, even though it was mentioned quite a number of times in our small groups, any reference to the ordination of women is not overtly mentioned in the document. And I spoke quite strongly to the fact that was a divergence among us, fair, but it should be named. But there wasn't a willingness at this stage to name that. And I pointed out that I am denied even thinking about ordination to priesthood, not because of my mind, not because of my education. I have a doctorate in scripture, not because of my passion for ministry, and not because I feel a call to ordination, but because of my body. That is the only reason that I'm not allowed to even think about that ministry within the church. That was an issue that was discussed at the tables. It was named in the Continental Assembly reports, but it didn't make its way into the synthesis document. In terms of justice, I have to say that social justice is well represented throughout the document. It talks about the church being poor in places, walking with the poor, being in support with the poor, not talking about the poor as objects, but but sharing that journey, all of us together, with special attention to migrants and refugees and those who are facing racial injustice. To my horror, this was a surprise. I was not surprised about the attitude towards women. I was very surprised that there was no interest at all in ecological justice. I was quite taken aback by that, given particularly Pope Francis first the Laudato Si, but then on the day of this opening of the Synod, his Laudate Deum was released, that we were paying no attention to it. And neither did the Instrumentum Laboris, by the way, except to stick in here and there, care for our common home in a list of ministries. I went on about that at length, and I will tell you this one time my voice was at least heard in a small way. We got Laudate Deum in the letter, and we got this sentence, which is my language, in the synthesis document itself. But there was no mention of cosmology, despite my plea to have that included. Another area of pain, much pain and suffering in the group, was around the members of the LGBTQ community within the church. And I thought that we would get this visibly in the document as an area of divergence, but visibly in the document. However, and the African bishops, and you have seen publicly their documents, so I'm not betraying any confidence in saying they did not want those letters used, because they feel they are being blackmailed by aid agencies to support LGBTQ rights, or they will be not receive the aid money that comes to their countries. When I spoke about the importance, though, of members of the community, the LGBTQ community within their diocese, they said, no, there are no members from the community in their diocese. And I said, that is impossible. That cannot be. It is not true of any society in the world from the beginning of time. However, it was important. There are two oblique references in the document, the one I'm showing here, certain issues, such as those relating to matters of identity and sexuality, the end of life, complicated marital situations, and artificial intelligence, are controversial not only in society but in the church because they raise new questions. And the document does say it is important to take the time required for this reflection to invest our best energies in it without giving into the simplistic judgments that hurt individuals in the body of the church. So there's an oblique reference. There's a second one similar to that. In terms of accountability, the conferences are encouraged to create a culture of lifelong formation and learning. And explicit reference was made to the need to implement structures and processes for the regular review of bishops' performance, as well as priests' performance. Pope Francis himself spoke rarely during our days. The times he did speak, several times he mentioned clericalism and the danger that that is posing for our church. The document also reminds us all that Pope Francis has spoken in Amoris Laetitia that we need to change the approach to baptized women and men in the church who are living in complex marital situations. And the document was strong about paying attention to that, even though we don't seem to be doing so. I mentioned earlier about the digital continent. There were the representatives of the digital continent there were a young man from Mexico who lives in the United States, the father of young children, and a young sister. And they spoke to the digital culture, our need to understand that culture because it's real, whether we want it or like it or dislike it is irrelevant. There is a digital environment that changes not only how we communicate, but how we learn, how we perceive time and space and relationships, and that reality is present among us and becoming more so. And it is not a distinct, as the synthesis document says, not a distinct area of mission, but it must be part of mission by its very presence in our lives, wherever we are on this earth. Two positive liturgical notes. One, that Eucharistic hospitality, that means being able to go to communion in our church, be examined more carefully. And this one was primarily in the context of interchurch marriages. And the need to correct that was pretty strong, and there was an openness to that. And I was pleasantly pleased to see this one, that liturgical texts and church documents be more attentive to the use of language that takes into equal consideration both women and men, includes a range of words, image, and narratives that draw on women's experience. The word fraternal and fraternity was used a zillion times. I said, I don't know enough about other languages to see that as an inclusive word, but I'll assure you in English, it's an exclusive word. I got almost all of them out. I think there are 5 got left in that they wouldn't take out, but it was a very predominant word. They thought it was an inclusive word, but certainly in English, it's not. Formation, obviously, if all of what I've said thus far, as limited as it is, means anything, it means all of us have to be part of ongoing formation. That we are subjects, co-responsible subjects of formation, not objects of formation. Those who are teachers in the gathering know what that means. And it's formation in a synodal key, which is a very nice phrase. to enable us to live out our vocation fully in the family, in the workplace, and ecclesial, social, intellectual spheres, and each one of us to live actively according to our own charisms and vocation. Formation in all kinds of things, in our exercise of co-responsibility, listening and discernment, in dialogue ecumenically in the interreligious sphere, in service to the poor, the poorest people among us, and care for our common home, formation in our engagement as digital missionaries, in discernment processes, in conversation of the spirit, in the spirit, consensus building, conflict resolution. In other words, formation most broadly, if we're going to truly be part of a transformed church that we need to be. What to do about this between last October and next October has not been clear. We just received a week before Christmas a document from the Synod team they actually went to the Conference of Bishops, and those of us who are voting delegates also received the document. And that document encouraged us to be part of conversations from October to October in two ways. One is deepening of synodality, and the other one is broadening of synodality. Deepening of synodality is for those who've already been in conversation about this, the people who've been participating in the parish conversations or the diocese conversations or the national or the continental conversations, or who were at the session of the Synod. So those of us who've already been in those conversations, we need to deepen our sense of what synodality means. And then broadening is reaching out beyond those groups to others who have not been part of the conversation to date. Reaching, not expecting them to come to us, but to going to the peripheries where they are and walking with and listening to them. Pope Francis reminded us the Synod is about synodality and not about this or that theme. The important thing is how the reflection is done in a synodal way. So whether it's deepening or a broadening, that holds true. I'm not going to go through all of this. I have this on the slides. Anybody who wants copies of these slides can have them. But I will just say to you that what the letter says is that we're to work in small groups, hopefully at the parish, diocesan, and then national and continental levels. Possibly they're suggesting, well, first of all, read the letter to the people of God and read the synthesis report. Then just choose maybe 3 priorities. So there are 20 chapters, as I mentioned, in the synthesis report. Just choose one of 3 of those, possibly, if you wish, one for each one. And 2 concrete initiatives. Now, good luck with that, because the concrete initiatives are not too concrete or explicit. But focus your attention, in other words. Why? Because each conference has to present, I'm just going to the last slide here. Each conference has to present a report, whether it's the Bishops' Conference in the Roman Catholic Church or the Oriental structures in the eastern part of the church in communion with Rome. They are to present their report in 8 pages by the 15th of May. So if you want to send messages, you have to make sure you're succinct, to the point, clear, consistent, to send to our own conference here in Canada, for example, get it to them in time for them to include it dramatically enough that they will include it in their 8 pages. And they also asked, in the broadening, the reaching out to other groups, that we send them to the bishops' conferences as well. And this time the bishops' conference have to put those into 2 pages. So I'm not sure how this is really going to work in a practical way. But then that work will go to the Synod team, who will develop a new instrumentum laboris that we will use in the assembly that gathers next October. So I want to finish on if I began with the Synod image, I want to end with the Synod image in another way. One of my jobs these days is in healthcare, and I spoke to a group in Prince Edward Island last summer on healthcare, and to thank me, they gave me a gift. I had hoped they were going to send me some chocolate, but they did, but they also sent me a gift. And that gift was a children's book. When I got it, I almost had a heart attack because it was so right. The name of the book was Walking Together. The book was written by a Mi'kmaq writer, an elder in Nova Scotia. The Mi'kmaq people live in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, in Newfoundland itself. But this was a Mi'kmaq writer from Nova Scotia and illustrated by a Mi'kmaq artist. It was a children's book by Indigenous people entitled Walking Together, and it was about learning from nature, all of which Pope Francis champions. So I said, I wonder, have I got the courage to give him the book? He would come a few moments early when he did come to the Synod Hall, so we could greet him. Being very shy, I wouldn't go up, except one day when I came in the hall. I had to come early because Sister had a meeting. This hall was empty, as you can see, practically. I said, this is my time to give Pope Francis the book. So you see, both of us are holding on the book. But what I want to do is show you the cover of that book. It could be an echo of the Synod image, as you can see. The people, all shapes and sizes, walking together, surrounded by the world in which we walk. Beautiful image. And I'm going to read a couple of pages from that book for you. These are images taken from the book itself. When we walk together in a good way, we learn to see the world through two eyes. We receive the gifts of Mother Earth through stories. When we walk together in a good way, things are revealed. We hear those who are returning and those who stayed sing the lands and waters awake after a deep rest. We are never alone. We need each other. Mawikwak, together we are strong. This is the Canadian delegates at the Synod. We were invited as a group to the Canadian Embassy for the Holy See. This is in the back garden of the embassy. You can see the Aurelian Wall, which is our back garden, which is pretty, for someone who studied Latin, is pretty spiffy. You can recognize some of the people, Archbishop Miller, Bishop Hosan, Bishop McGrattan, and Cardinal Lacroix are there. There's Sister Desmarais, Chantal Desmarais, who's wearing the habit. The lay woman there is Linda Stout. She's from education from Ontario. The layman you can see there, the ambassador has the blue shirt on in the middle of the picture. The man on the right is Sami Awan, who is Lebanese descent in Sherbrooke. The University of Sherbrooke, lives in Quebec. Quite taken, as you can picture, his attention with the war around Hamas and Israel when we were there. One person was missing from the photograph. She is Professor Catherine Clifford, whose picture is on the corner there. She teaches at St. Paul University, has done a lot of work on Vatican II. So all of us at the Synod Assembly, the voting delegates and the others, were 469 in total, where our church is 1.4 billion. So obviously our voice is very small in that moment. So I'm encouraging everybody I meet with, I say yes to everybody I can who asks me to talk to them, encouraging each one of you to become a welcoming presence, to go to the peripheries of the world, to encourage others to join. I believe this will be the last time that we will have a chance to help transform our church. It will be the last time for a few generations if we miss this opportunity. The odds are not great that we will catch the opportunity, but if we don't try, we certainly won't. So that's my message to you. And I think I probably went on a bit longer than you expected me to, Veronica or Daniel. So questions,
Yes.
comments?
Can I just say, we wanted to go into small groups just briefly, just to give ourselves an opportunity to talk about what you had to say in small groups. And we're still going to do that. We'll take about 12 minutes. And remember, when you get into your group, an economy of time, just that, but if you can each be succinct, but what did you hear that struck you? And what a call or kind of sense of future drawing do you get out of what Elizabeth has been saying to us about the Synod? So just share that with one another. Paul will put us into groups, and we'll call you back in 12 minutes. So as people are returning, I'll say I want to thank you again, Elizabeth, just on my own behalf. We had said that we would end this Zoom by 1 o'clock. That was our plan, that we would go for an hour and a half and end at 1 o'clock, at 1 o'clock Central. And then we would keep the Zoom room open for another half hour for questions, comments, whatever people wanted to say. So we're running a bit late. So what I would like to propose is that I would call on Louise Doan first to thank you formally, Elizabeth, and then we'll expect those of you who need to leave, and then we'll have a half hour just where we can take questions and comments and queries. Is that okay? Are you ready to go roll with that, Louise?
Yeah. Okay. Well, Sister Elizabeth, on behalf of Reseau Compassion Network, the Grey Nuns of Montreal, the Sisters of the Mission, and the Catholic Network for Women's Equality, and as well for everyone who gathered on the Zoom call today, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for sharing with us your experience as a voting delegate at the Synod. Sister Elizabeth, when we spoke last week to prepare for this meeting, you had mentioned that in the Catholic world, Canada is a small country. And within that small country, you come from one of our smallest provinces. And what that brought to mind for me was the story of David and Goliath. And what I take from that story is that we all have our unique gifts and skills to draw upon when we can be faced with what can seem like an insurmountable challenge. And I wanted to thank you for being here today to inspire us to use our voices and to look at our strengths in an effort to effect positive change in the Catholic Church moving forward. I'd also like to thank you for allowing us, and hopefully in the next half an hour as well, to share our thoughts with you and with each other in our hopes for the Church. So thank you as well. And finally, to close that, thank you as well for representing Canada as a voting delegate at the Synod in Rome. So.
Thank you, Louise. I deeply appreciate your very kind words, and even more appreciate that you're giving me the opportunity here to speak to people and to hear from people. And I don't know if it's you or Veronica or Daniel I'm asking this question to. You will have the video of this, but also I will send you, if it would be any benefit, a PDF of my slides, simply because of the size of the photographs. It's just smaller in a PDF, and then people can get that from you.
Oh, great. Great.
The other thing is, if people feel they want to send me a strong message other than my red jacket, My email address, don't hesitate to email me if you wish, edavis@sistersofmercynf.org. If you want to send the message that you want me to hear that I can bring on to the Synod.
Sister Veronica, we'll make sure at the Reseau Compassion Network that we distribute the slideshow, and Sister Elizabeth, with your permission, will also share your email address with the group. Is that okay? Good. Thank you very much. Receive that.
Great. Thanks,
Over to you,
Dan.
Sister Veronica.
Thanks, Dan.
There's a question there about how to access to get the letter and the synthesis document. Veronica or Daniel, you can certainly put them on your website, but you can also just Google Synod on Synodality, Letter to the People of God, or Synod on Synodality, Synthesis Report, and you will immediately be brought to those documents. So it's very accessible on site in English, French, and in many languages, more than just the 5. So it's just Google Synod on Synodality, Letter to the People of God, Synod on Synodality, Synthesis Report, and you'll get the documents.
What was your email address again, please?
eDavis, EDAVIS,
Mm-hmm.
at sistersofmercynf.org.
And we'll send that with the email to Mary Lou.
Okay.
Paul, do you want to give us instructions about how to proceed now for these, our questions within the larger group?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Sister Veronica.
Yeah.
Given the number of people still in the room, we thought the best way would be if you could use the raise hand feature in Zoom. And you'll find that at the bottom of your screen, next to stop and start video. If you can't find a raise hand button, you can look inside reactions and you should find it there too. I see some people are raising their hand, and then Sister Veronica will acknowledge you.
I'll call on the people and
then you can take yourself off mute and we'll be off.
Yes.
Good stuff. All right.
Okay. So the first one that I see is Joe Gunn. Joe?
Joe, you're muted. I think you know that, do you?
Thank you for your presentation, Sister Elizabeth. I'm wondering if, I think everybody that's heard you speak knows that you could single-handedly respond to the December 2023 note that you received from the Synodal team and the CCCB, but is that document at all, it was brand new to me. Is that something that can be shared? And is there some way that anybody who's participating in this particular event can provide input through our parishes or our own dioceses?
The first answer is a public document. So I think Veronica has a copy of that, so you can easily share that. But the second question is a harder question, and that is, how do you get input to go to that? According to that document, as I understand it, you have to go through your bishops' conferences. And so that means you have your local bishop is your first point of call, or your local parish. I do think there are other groups like the religious congregations maybe will go through their conferences of religious as well. I'm somewhat mystified though about how some of the groups on the peripheries who are not in the church structure get their voices heard. I am kind of worried about that actually. So I'm speaking to a number of those groups, and I'll have at least that much that I can bring, but I'm just one voice. So Joe, I think someone of your presence in the church and your position in the church, you need to be talking to the crowd at CCCB and ask them how they go about that. How you go about including the voices of those that are not going to go through a parish or something like that. How those voices get heard. Because that's the group I worry about. And it's all going from the CCCB in 8 pages and then 2 pages. So, and that's English and French. So somehow somebody's got to talk to the bishops, I think, to see where they're going to take this for us.
Okay, thank you.
That's not too
Christine?
helpful, but I can't, I'm mystified and I know what I'm supposed to be doing, so.
So Christine?
Hi, Elizabeth, you may remember I'm from Our Lady's
Remember you
Missionary.
very well, yes.
And I'm also a member of the Catholic Network for Women's Equality. I have two questions. One, there was quite a bit of hullaboo about the quote unquote secrecy of the synod. Now, I remember having mixed feelings because I know from our own chapters that the conversations are supposed to be confidential and all of that. And I just was wondering what you felt about that, because even the National Catholic Reporter kind of went off onto this is being too secret. My second question is about this recording, whether it's going to be made public, and because I live across the street from Presentation Manor, would I ever be able to show this to people at Presentation Manor?
I think the
Yes.
second question is easily answered is yes, Veronica, right? You're going to
Yeah.
make that available.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's not an issue. The first question is a harder question about, and the Pope never said it would be secret. He did ask that we not talk to the media. And if we did talk to the media, simply talk of our own lived experience. So when I've been meeting with groups since I came back early November, that's why you have all of that insight into my personal experience, being faithful to, and I think there's sense in that it's my lived experience of the synod that's part of the gift that I bring. I can understand where the Pope is coming from on the other, because we would have been bombarded by groups who taught on all sides of an issue. That people who were very much set against the synod and very much hoped the synod would fail, very much felt the synod wasn't faithful to church teaching, and then a group on the opposite side who says you need to listen to people whose voices are not very often heard. So I can see, and that could have been distracting to the people who were sitting in that room. When we came back, though, that limitation wasn't there. So, to me, and to me, that's the gift of the two parts that the Pope, he's a very skilled communicator. By putting the second session on next October, he gave people like me that chance for these 10 months to be going out and doing what I should be doing, which is listening to and talking to groups. So he probably found the right, if it had only been 2023 and that was the only session, I think that would have been a major concern. But the fact that that became, in a sense, that moment when we came together, now go talk to people and then come back. And I suspect the second session won't have that same cloak around it. And that's my perception anyway. And the very thing, the thought that they did say to us, speak out of your lived experience of church and how you experience it in synod, I think was pretty important. So that's my answer to that. Now, there were many leaks from the synod, the hall itself, which fascinated me but anyway, now I'm going to as many peripheries as I know in my place, not too many peripheries here. I'm usually in the middle of everything. So, but I am going out to groups who would not normally be part of it to hear their voices and absorb their wisdom, so that when I go back, I'll go back a bit wiser than I.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I understand that calling it a synod on synodality, that Pope Francis was really trying to say we need to have a new way of being church, like of listening to one another and of embracing the wisdom of all. Could you say more about that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, and that word is so weird. I mean, that phrase, I as I said in an interview I did, like at the breakfast table, most people, even in my community, don't talk about the synod and synodality. It's not language we're used to, but that in a sense is part of its gift, because it forces, if you're any interest at all, like people said to me, Elizabeth, what are you doing now?
Mhm.
So it gave me a perfect chance to show I knew some Greek, which is always good for my ego. But and when that book, that little children's book, like I bought so many copies of it myself and given them to my own nieces, grandnieces, and grandnephews, but also encourage people to do the same, because that does what the Synod on Synodality does for us adults. That does the very same thing, so simply and profoundly, walking together. So it gave the word synod is such a perfect phrase when you think about it. So using a strange language actually became a way to get us call us into conversation.
Mhm.
The fact that we needed a synod on synodality, not just a synod on something else. Pope Francis says that his listening to the young people at the Synod on Youth convinced him that we needed to become that kind of church, not a church that had those kinds of meetings every now and then.
Mhm.
And even the phrase conversation in the spirit, originally in the language, they call that spiritual conversations. And somebody said to me, Elizabeth, how come you changed the name of that? And I said, well, I didn't change the name of it. They did. But now that it dawns on me what it meant, because spiritual conversations is such a vague term, conversations in the spirit mean that you're having conversation together and you're inviting the spirit who's begging to come to sit with you for those conversations, which is a very different thing than that rather nebulous spiritual conversation. So words do matter. Words are important.
Thank you. Dorothy Lewandowski. Are you there?
So you need to unmute.
Dorothy, okay, there.
You had it for one moment,
Yeah.
Sister Dorothy. Just try it
Dorothy,
again.
will you try to get are you there?
There we go.
Okay.
I think I'm unmuted. Elizabeth, if you could say something more about, you ended with a tone of urgency, urgency in the church that something happened. Can you say a little more about that? You said something about this may be our last chance.
I've stayed faithful to the church. I've been very involved in processes in our own archdiocese to try to strengthen our church. So, and I'm very critical of our church. So, this has been a lifelong commitment for me. I'm old enough to have been a young sister after Vatican II, and when we only knew Vatican II. So I was young enough that I was there after all the changes. I never wore the old habit, in other words. So I saw with Vatican II the potential that we had to become transformed. And I saw women religious around the world change because of Vatican II. But I saw our church not change, not very much. So the plea for lay people to become the center of the church fell on deaf ears. The plea to be reaching out in ecumenism really didn't go very far. Deo Verbum, the document on scripture, which is my passion, didn't go where it was called to go. So I lived in a time of incredible potential for transformation and experienced some of it in religious life. Pope Francis sees the church that I see. People like me, even my age, walking away from the church. People pained by the church. People hurt by the church. And I spoke to a parish last week. I went thinking 30 people will show up, I hope. And there must have been over 160 people there. And after we finished, it was late in the night, a winter's night, cold and dark and windy here. For 1/2 hour afterwards, people waited, lined up to talk to me one-on-one about their experience of church, which was a painful experience. So my hurt is not that people are walking away from the church, as bad as that is. The hurt I feel is that we're living in a broken, fractured world with so much violence, so much hate, so much exclusion. If 1.4 billion of us were on task here, if 1.4 billion of us really believed in inclusion and respect and justice, imagine the world we could influence. And our church is so caught up with protecting itself now that we're not doing the good that we could be. We're doing a lot of good, but we're not doing the intensity of good we could be doing in our world if we had our act together, if we were a synodal church in mission. If Pope Francis can't get us to do it, I'm not sure the next two popes will be able to do it either. So he did not call another council. He chose to go this route, which in the modern world was probably a wiser way to go, very different from the 1960s. But it'll probably be another time, like another 60 years, before we'll have the energy and the passion for the vision that we have at this moment in time. So if we don't do this, some of us will stay faithful to the church to the end, but we will have lost an opportunity to do greater good for the earth, for people, for society at large. And that saddens.
Thank you.
That's where my urgency comes from, Dorothy.
Thanks a lot. Jane Krzyzanowski.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Sister Elizabeth. I was encouraged. My heart just was full. And this issue of the urgency to do something. In our little group, we talked about, can we get together again to build on what you have presented to us today? You may have talked longer than you thought, but it was really rich and wonderful and a perfect foundation for us to continue the conversation. And I think it's important for people who are here today to have that opportunity to come together again, because many of us are those people who are on the margins, those people who have been pushed out of the church. For myself, I'm a Roman Catholic woman priest. I have felt the call to be a priest from the time I was a little girl. And when, I won't go through my vocational call here, but I had to answer that call, even in my 70s. Now that I'm in my 80s, I still feel that burn to have something going on for the future of our church, with women as being equal leaders and participants in facilitating the life-giving love of a God that doesn't have a gender, and a care of the earth that is beyond what we can imagine right now. So can we get together again?
Thank you very much, Jane. We'll certainly take that, your question. I wrote it down.
And I want to comment as well, and thank you, Jane, for what you do and what you said. I also encourage groups to meet, as does the Synod document, because I truly believe in integral ecology. I truly believe, even with our meeting here today and our sharing here today, we have now made the sacred communion of all creation a little bit stronger by our just in this quiet little couple of hours. And I think every group that meets, the Gospels are right, where 2 or 3 are meeting, I am in their midst. When we meet in small groups, the energy and the hope and the communion that gets created there doesn't stay there. It actually builds into that communion of all creation. That's why the integral ecology matters so much to me. So I really encourage you to meet this group, certainly Veronica will look at, but also meeting in your own small groups, talking about these things, encouraging others, going out to your peripheries and bringing others into the conversations. That walking together, remember the little child's book, when we walk together, we see with 2 eyes and we see differently. So I really encourage that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Danielle.
Yeah, thanks, Sister Elizabeth. I just want to see if I can get some pearls of wisdom from you along this sense of urgency. And I've shared this with you when we did the kind of chat before this, but I feel strongly there's a bunch of my colleagues that are on this call as well. As you know, we're a sponsor organization of a bunch of health and human services here in our area. Men, people of all faith traditions that are on the front lines caring for whoever may be challenged in so many different ways. And there's a real tension that we're hearing from our leaders around what we hope we continue to pay attention to, which is this notion of love, of service, of connection, of encounter, of walking with. And yet, in this world that's screaming for inclusivity, the real tension our leaders are saying is we have people in our organizations and people in communities saying we don't believe the church believes that anymore. There's a message that it's yes, but. And you've mentioned it, and I know it's on the table in terms of conversation, the role of women in the church, how we're walking with people who would identify the LGBTQ+. My question is, this is not dissimilar to what I'm hearing from other leaders across the country around the whole Ministry of Health and Human Services. What's our calling now, Sister Elizabeth? What's the next step? Any wisdom on how we get engaged quickly as a movement? Because I think it's a big voice. And it's an opportunity for us to share what we're thinking. Any thoughts, Elizabeth? I don't know that's fair to ask of you, but there's the question.
No, it's not. I mean, that's why I've said yes to doing this. I'll tell you where I'm from. I came out of education initially, and then I went into healthcare administration. And so theoretically, I'm not a nun. I'm just Elizabeth Davis. Now everybody in the province calls me Sister Elizabeth, as you know. So, but the work you do in whatever the ministry is, and this is one good thing about the synthesis report and about the process, that recognition that we're co-responsible in mission, that whether you're a Hindu doctor or your Buddhist nurse or your atheist anesthetist, everybody working in your organization for the good of the people of your area is in mission. And the more they trust that, the more they believe that, the more they know that, the less exclusive they will be, in my experience. I was part of a major study in our province on health and how we improve health. And I think the two of us who led that process with a group of 138 people, we spoke on a health study. The most important thing was inclusion. The Surgeon General of the United States, who's a military man, said the biggest health issue in the United States is loneliness, not cancer, not heart disease, not even poverty, loneliness. So the more inclusive we can be, whether it's inclusive in our thinking, inclusive in our reaching out to people who are different from us, inclusive to going into the peripheries, the very act of doing that builds itself. You create a little larger circle and then a larger circle. So I'm convinced now that, maybe it's because I'm getting so old that I need to be convinced of this, but that the more we talk about this, the more we reflect on this, the more we act on this, the more we can call others into this, that does make our world better, and that makes the world better. Some of the processes we have in place are not good about letting that influence the more powerful parts of it, the church. And some people are still being punished for stating positions that are not against the official teaching of the church. And bit by bit, Pope Francis is trying to wear that down. His recent statement on same-sex blessings, which doesn't go far enough for the LGBTQ community, I am sure, but it's certainly on our traditional path, goes very far to talking about the importance of pastoral accompaniment. We were part of a movement around medical assistance in dying, where we had to work with our government to find a way for our long-term care facility to work within the law that changed for our province. And we found a way I believe, that respectfully managed that balance, found that harmony. So I think you celebrate the small wins, Daniel. Never be relentless, though, in being persistently relentless. Champion the people who are really good at doing this, and then trust that that is going to make the difference that you want. And remember, the person who plants the acorn never will sit under the oak tree, because it takes too long for it to grow.
Oh, thank you. Jerry.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for everything you've said, and a few others before me, Jane and Daniel, said some of the things I was going to ask you about, so you've covered those. I just want to say I commend you for standing up, truly standing up. You've done that for a long time. I remember when you came to Manitoba a long time ago around Catholic healthcare, and inspired us around vision of not controlling, but really focusing on mission. And so, but in our small little group, the aspect of collectively getting together, again, those that want to, was also brought up. So I think I'm leaving that with Daniel to follow up on that. But I do think it would be important to continue the relationship with yourself as well through that as much as you could, because there are aspects of these acorns planting that could continue, I believe. You gave us one with the book. So I'm a believer in doing that through the Indigenous and the First Peoples as well. And I started sending out a little book on Richard Wagame's and Embers as a gift, because I was gifted some things from the Indigenous. And so it's amazing how the book has accomplished a whole lot of things on its own and gifting from others. So I believe that what you said about the children's book is one of those ways that all of us could really contribute and do a lot of things with it. So thank you so much.
Show the book again. Show the book again.
Oh, this one?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, my wife says, oh, another set of books from Amazon again. And anyways, so
Okay.
yeah.
All right, thanks, Jerry. Maureen.
Elizabeth, thank you. You are indeed gift to us and gift to the church. When I see on Zoom, this particular Zoom, I am thrilled that there's 140 of us, women mostly. I don't think there are many clergy present. We still live in a clerical structure. And I think there's a gap between lay people trying to move ahead with the synod and the clergy not necessarily wanting to move ahead. Would you reflect on that, please?
You're in agreement with Pope Francis on that. So you're in good company, Maureen. One of the sadnesses for me at the synod, despite my distaste for hierarchy, was there were hardly any parish priests there. There were a couple there, but they were there for other roles they played, not because they're parish priests. My experience is that the parish priests are not always getting along with their bishops, number one, and that somehow they have been overlooked in all this process and have not been encouraged to live out the synod or the engagement in the synod. Now, I know there are several priests on this call, Maureen, whom I know personally by name, and they've been faithful to this process for a long time, and I really commend them for that fidelity. And I'm not sure how to reach parish priests in the way that we need to. I do know they are the ones closest to the people in the churches. And until they're convinced of the importance and power of this, we've lost a very invaluable ally. So I feel for priests. Priests and I have varied relationships, but I do feel for priests in the time that we're in. I feel for their uncomfortable place in the hierarchy. And I also feel for I suspect they feel excluded, would be my perception. And that's fair. And in our church, that's not going to help anybody, I suspect, moving forward. I don't know how we're going to address that. I don't know how our bishops are going to address that. And I know Pope Francis is really outspoken against clericalism, probably the one thing he's most outspoken against. He's almost unbelievably outspoken against. He mentions it so often. So I think he's tormented by the clericalism he sees and feels that that's counterproductive to a synodal church. And until it changes, we're never going to be able to have a synodal church. So I'm just, I think, echoing, Maureen, what you're saying, as opposed to giving you some insights into it. My only way of dealing with it in my diocese is to offer to speak to priests whenever, to agree to speak to priests whenever they ask me, but to say to our bishop, if you want me to talk to the priests here, just call me, you know that, bishop. So that's the best I can do here in my lived world. And I do mention it, that I was chagrined how invisible they were at the synod itself.
Thank you. We have come to almost to the end of our time. We are at the end of our time, but Sandy Stewart had her hand up before the hour. So I'm sorry, Terry, we won't take your question because your hand went up after the half hour. We'll take Sandy's to end.
Thanks, Veronica. Thank you, Elizabeth. I was just caught up on one thing in particular when you were speaking about the LGBTQ question with the African bishop. And I was having a conversation this morning with someone about the gay lesbian issue in Africa is can cost you your life. So I think as a member of that community, I feel a certain importance of giving it voice in a society that I'm relatively safe. But in Uganda, let's say that government just passed, again, laws that prohibit. And so this idea that there aren't any gay lesbians, as you said to them, that's not possible, I felt encouraged by. But in terms of maybe not at the table, is there any discussion about that amongst the bishops inside the fact that talking about gay lesbian issues can cost people their lives? And so people don't talk about it. You can be betrayed quite easily. So that kind of topic, I think, where it's kind of costly, I was interested to know if that ever came up, maybe not at your table, but over the lunch that you might have had.
Now, there was some open conversation in the plenary, but not from Africa. That would have been from other countries like ours, where the conversation has switched. I will say the African bishops are very strong on this. They say it is cultural, and they point to the number of countries where it is against the law, and there are significant punishments for breaking them. So to some degree, the bishops are protecting the people, that if they become too vocal about this on the positive side, they could well put people at risk, because people will then feel more courageous and say something or do something that make themselves known to be from the community, and then will be at risk. So I think to some degree that truly is a pastoral response. There is some degree, though, in the culture of denial. And this is where we probably would have been in our cultures 50 years ago, so even for us around this room, this is not something that was way before my time. If you're 25 on this call, that's a different conclusion. But it's only 15 years ago that television starts to normalize relationships within the community. The Hallmark Channel is only in the past 3 years that they've started to normalize it. So even in the most advanced societies, which would be North America, and probably ironically Canada more than the United States, that is
Right.
starting to be visibly normalized. So, and I'm hoping I'll live for a day where we don't have to use our pronouns, where we don't use language of coming out, because it doesn't matter. We're all where we are. But that's not going to happen in my lifetime, even in Canada.
Right, right.
With the African bishops, so I will say, and it was an Indian cardinal, not the non-African, who said to me, Elizabeth, will you send me some scientific material about what you're talking about? Because I've never even thought about male, female as a dualism before. That never dawned on me before. Will you send me some of that biological and social science stuff you've been saying supports what you're saying? So
Wow.
I keep seeing the bishops myself. The majority of the bishops are like the majority of us on this call, in the middle. And they're not dead set against anything. They're not going to be sticking their necks about too far about anything, but they will genuinely listen when they think it's the right thing to do. And, you know, I've been told about bishops who, now that the Pope has spoken about that same-sex blessing, have actually done it. Cardinal Greg himself has spoken publicly how his mind changed as he was in conversation with the family in his home place. So, you know, for most people, most ordinary people, we're in that middle, we're in that normal curve, the big part of that normal curve. And when we either know people personally, or we see it on television as normal, straightforward, or the Pope seems to think this is okay, then we'll begin to move.
Yeah.
So I have some empathy with the African bishops because of their fear that people will be put on.
That they'll be harmed, for sure.
Some frustration with them. They're theologically quite conservative. So, but one, to be fair, I had good conversations with them and could say to them blankly, Bishop, that is not statistically possible, what you just said.
Yeah, yeah.
So that I could be honest like that with him, an African bishop, tells you that I felt safe to say that to him there.
Yeah. Thank you.
So there's some hope, I guess, and some hope.
Absolutely. Every seed helps. Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth.
And just to say to Terry, if your question is something you really need me to answer, don't hesitate, just email me. Okay, Veronica, back to you.
Yeah, I'm just in the midst of typing it up, so thank you.
Okay.
And can I ask you, Paul, for some reason I'm not able to access the chat. Paul, would you copy the chat for me before you close the system down to send it to me? Can you do that? Do you know how to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And we can look at the chat and send relevant comments from that chat to people. When we send out the slides from you, Elizabeth, we will also send a link to the recording, and we will put it up on the websites of the Reseau Compassion Network, the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions, and CNWE for 3. Others, just let us know. So we're committed to spreading the word as much as we can. I'm sorry for Terry that we didn't get to you for your question. I'm glad you're putting it in the chat. Thank you to everyone. We're still 127 people online, so that says something.
No, I'm sending Elizabeth an email. It won't be in the chat, so don't wait for that.
Okay, good. And thank you again, Elizabeth, so much for your time with us. I have a feeling you'll be hearing more from us in the future.
Well, as I said, I'm doing this selfishly because I need to leave to go back wiser than I left. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and keep praying and keep being synodal yourself in your space so that we become that way a more synodal church.
Yeah. Thank you.